Not ya Māori te ngācha takoa. Kia ora koutou, my name is Lily Atu, and tonight I'm going to be speaking about resistance movements in Whanganui-a-Tara. This is a topic very close to my heart, having grown up as a Pasifika person in Aotearoa on Māori land. I'm going to cover some really confronting topics, including nuclear testing, disposition of land, racial targeting, and systematic violence. And if at any point you feel overwhelmed and need to leave, then feel free to jump outside and take a moment. But I also want to reframe something else: the struggle, the fight back, and resistance. So I ask, what can we learn from Whanganui-a-Tara? How can we learn from past movements, mobilizations, and struggles in the Pacific and take that forth into our actions now? These questions will be central throughout. So there's this idea of resistance. What does this mean? Linda Tuhiwai-Smith writes, "To resist is to retrench in the margins, retrieve what we were, and remake ourselves." And she states that struggle is a tool of both social activism and theory. It is a tool that has the potential to enable oppressed groups to embrace and mobilize agency, and to turn the consciousness of injustice into strategies for change. Struggle can be mobilized as resistance and as transformation. So resistance is not only an objection, but it's also a reclamation. Some of the most significant challenges our Pacific communities face are land dispossession, the ongoing legacy of nuclear colonialism, climate change, and continuing struggles for self-determination. Anti-imperial resistance and struggle in the Pacific takes many forms. It looks like the struggle for independence for Kanaky, for independence in West Papua, for self-determination in Palau, and the Marshall Islands. And here in Aotearoa, we are seeing resistance against the intense attacks on tangata whenua play out right now. We have most recently seen our own government's outrageous attempts to change legislation undermining Māori rights through the proposal of the Treaty Bill, the Regulatory Standards Bill, the abolishment of Te Aka Whaiora, the Māori Health Authority, and a myriad of other examples. But alongside these attacks, we have also seen resistance. The Hikoi mō Te Tiriti, where over 40,000 people marched for Māori rights, reminded the nation that Māori resistance is powerful and not new. Māori have a long history resisting colonial domination. From the 1975 Hikoi to Parliament, to the 506 occupation of Takaparafo in the late 70s, to the foreshore and seabed protest in 2004, and the occupation of Ihumātao against land developers in 2016. These are just some of the many acts that shape what resistance looks like here in Aotearoa. Pasifika communities also have a history of resistance in this country. One of the most shameful attacks by the New Zealand government on Pacific peoples were the Dawn Raids in the late 70s, in which Pacific communities were disproportionately targeted and forcefully deported for overstaying on short-term labor contracts. The government cracked down on Pacific communities as the scapegoats to shift blame of economic decline and unemployment. These raids were made possible by the Immigration Act of 1964 and its later amendments. But our Pacifica communities fought back. The revolutionary group, the Polynesian Panthers, most notably held counter-dawn raids against politicians that were supporting the racial targeting of Pacific Islanders. The Polynesian Panthers also held homework centres in churches, ran food co-ops, and provided free transportation for the families of prison inmates who wanted to visit them, taking a lot of inspiration from the frameworks developed by the Black Panthers in the United States. The dawn raid of a Pasifika man in 2023, just 2 years after the government's apology, shows that New Zealand isn't finished with this chapter of history. Instead of creating more pathways for Pasifika peoples to gain residency, Immigration NZ admitted that between July 2022 and April 2023, about 19 home visits were conducted outside of hours. The relationship between New Zealand and the rest of the Pacific is still shaped by colonial structures. This looks like everything between the short-term visa schemes that leave workers vulnerable and the nominally free association agreements New Zealand has with Niue and the Cook Islands. New Zealand continues to benefit from an extractive relationship with other Pacific countries. One of the most devastating examples of this colonial relationship was the 1918 influenza pandemic New Zealand recklessly brought by a passenger and cargo ship to Samoa, which killed a fifth of Samoa's entire population. This same pandemic had severe impacts on Māori, who had a death toll 8 times that of Europeans in New Zealand. The outrage at the devastations of the influenza helped to lay the foundations for the Samoan Mau movement, a major anti-imperialist movement for Samoa. Now, we're witnessing billionaires and government officials building up hyper-militarization across the region. The AUKUS Pact, the biennial RIMPAC military muscle show in Hawaii, and a global record military spend in 2024 do not make our future look bright. Western powers have long made Pacific countries dependent on aid agreements, but these are barely about actual support. They're instead designed for market expansion, resource access, and geopolitical control. I hope to draw out central insights on the challenges we face and the solidarity we must continue to build to carry us forward in our own fights happening right now, by looking into the ongoing resistance of Kanak, who have been fighting for their rights to self-determination for centuries, the movement for a nuclear-free Pacific, which embodied a fight against militarization and colonialism, and the complex historic struggles in Fiji, where claims to indigeneity were used to fracture multiracial working-class unity. Early last year in New Caledonia, thousands of Kanak, especially youth, took to the streets to protest a bill which would grant French citizens who had lived in the territory for more than 10 years the right to vote. This bill threatened to dilute the indigenous Kanak vote and would jeopardize the struggle for independence. The protests were met with violent repression by security forces, who used tear gas and stun grenades against pro-independence demonstrators. The clash resulted in the deaths of 14 people, most of them Kanak. This violent clash stands in a context of years of France's ongoing domination and suppression of Kanak self-determination and decolonization. In 1998, the Nouméa Accord was signed following years of Kanak resistance. It limited voting in provincial elections to those who had lived in New Caledonia prior to 1998 and their children. This was meant to safeguard Kanak representation in the face of a growing settler population. And as part of the Nouméa Accord, 3 independence referendums were held in 2018, in 2020, and then in 2021. The first 2 resulted in narrow votes against independence, and the third was cruelly forced through by French President Macron amid a Kanak boycott during a devastating time of mourning the hundreds of Kanak deaths from COVID-19. Since the 1970s, New Caledonia has seen large-scale migration from France during the nickel boom. Indigenous Kanak have been made into a minority in their own lands, now making up less than half the population. This transformation has not been an accident. It is a calculated strategy to ensure that France can maintain control and continue to exploit Kanaky and her people. Māori activist Tina Ngata even makes the point that France has financially incentivized French nationalists to move there. France annexed New Caledonia in 1853, and similarly to colonization in Australia, used Kanak land as a penal colony for convicts and political prisoners. This era of repression was underpinned by the Code du Lidégénat, a native regulations code common across French colonies before World War II. This code severely restricted the rights of Kanak people, excluded them from political and public engagement, limiting their freedom of movement and confining them to colonial reservations. Although the code was officially abolished in 1946, its legacy of marginalization has of course endured. Kanak have resisted colonial domination for more than 250 years, and it is to this long-standing struggle that we now turn. In 1878, the leader, Chief Atai, led a significant rebellion against French colonial forces. Central to this resistance was the alienation of Kanak from their ancestral lands and the destruction of cultural autonomy. But it was the abduction by a convict settler of an Indigenous woman from her home, a symbolic act of everyday colonial violence, that triggered this movement. Freedom fighters took up arms and launched coordinated attacks on French forces. Over 1,000 Kanak were murdered, including Chief Atai and 200 Europeans. Although this uprising had many devastating outcomes, it helped to create a legacy of resistance, a historical memory in which future generations could draw from in struggles yet to come. Growing tensions and continued French repression led to further revolts throughout the early and mid-20th century. culminating into the 1984 election boycott. By the 1970s and 80s, the pro-independence movement gained momentum, marked by the rise of so-called radical leftist groups and a more organized political strategy. To broaden the pro-independent front's popular base, the FLNKS, so Kanak Socialist National Liberation Front, was formed and quickly became a central force in the independence campaign. In 1984, Kanak strategically launched an active boycott of the November elections. On election day, 200 protesters entered a polling station in Cronulla and set fire to ballot papers. The freedom fighter, Elua Mashoro, split open a ballot box with an axe at Cronulla in a powerful symbolic gesture of resistance. Mashoro and the FLNKS then militantly seized the nickel mining town of Theo, holding it for 3 weeks. They barricaded roads and restricted access to the town, demanding the annulment of the election result, the rejection of the Lamont statute, which failed to meet Kanak demands, and the recognition of a provisional Kanak government. A little side note on Eloi is as he was shot by French snipers, there's this sort of the story about how he was there dying, and he says, death is nothing, only the struggle counts. So I just thought I'd add that in. And yeah, people still seem to hold on to that memory. Waves of violence followed the election boycott. The most devastating incident came on December the 5th, 1984. Just weeks after the powerful act of splitting the ballot box, 10 Kanak were ambushed and murdered by armed anti-independence French nationalists while returning from a community meeting where they had resolved to pursue peaceful negotiations with the French state. Shortly after, Eloi Mashoro was assassinated by French security forces. Rather than silence the movements, these devastating events further influenced it. The Ouvert massacre in 1998 marked another significant point in a brutal military assault. French forces killed 19 Kanak who had taken hostages during a standoff before the elections. The scale and violence of the repression contributed to the decision for peace negotiations and the Matignon Accord, which was signed by independence and anti-independence leaders alike. The Noumea Accord, signed in 1998 as a follow-up from the Matignon Accord, was presented as a path to self-determination for Kanaky. However, under its terms, France retained significant control over the military, foreign policy, immigration, policing, and more. Now, the 2-decade period between the start of the Noumea Accord and the first referendum for independence in 2018 provided France the opportunity to increase the settler population, thereby further marginalizing the indigenous population. While this accord was framed as a pathway for self-determination, in practice, France did little to prepare French settlers for the possibility of independence. Instead, under Macron, France made an effort to manipulate electoral rules to favor French Caldoche and dilute the political voice of Kanak. Just in the last few days, a new agreement has been signed that would make New Caledonia a state, but still would remain French. While this may seem like things could be changing, this is clearly an attempt for France to quell demands and retain as much control as possible. This agreement does not grant true independence and falls far short of the long-standing demands of the Kanak struggle for self-determination. So why does France continue its chokehold on Kanaky? Power and profit. Control over Pacific territory, access to mineral wealth, and the strategic location for military and nuclear interests. This has nothing to do with the welfare of Kanak. As Susanna Une states, Kanak social independence is total self-determination, political, economic, and cultural. This is not the end of the fight. From Chifatai, Eloi Mashoro, to Susanna Une, Kanak have never stopped fighting for freedom, for emancipation, and neither can we. This form of violent domination is of course not unique to France. West Papua has endured over a century of brutal colonial rule, first under Dutch administration for more than 60 years, followed by Indonesia's occupation beginning with its invasion in 1963. Their struggle has been marked by widespread poverty, systematic violence, racial discrimination, and human rights abuses, including torture and political repression. Despite these relentless injustices, West Papuans have continued to fight, mobilize, and resist. Similarly, although Timor-Leste, or what is commonly known as East Timor and Timor-Leste, gained independence from Indonesian rule in 2002, it continues to grapple with colonial dependence on Indonesia, which maintains economic and political influence over the country. As we are confronted with geopolitical intensification and a pivot from country-specific agendas to multilateralism, there is space to reflect on the nuclear-free Pacific movement that was building from the 60s and how that historical context stands in the challenges we face today. AUKUS is a security alliance signed last year by Australia, the UK, and the US, which is part of a dehumanizing legacy of nuclear violence in Whanganui-a-Tara. AUKUS will enable Australian acquisition of nuclear submarines, a long-term plan to develop new nuclear weapons, which will take decades to complete, and will increase militarisation under the smokescreen of security. But who is it for? AUKUS is not beneficial for everyday people. It's not beneficial for the working class, and it certainly goes against the way Pacific people conceive of our own security. One only has to look at the violent and devastating histories of nuclear bombing and waste in the Pacific by the West. This hyper-militant defense alliance against China is a pretext to plunder and pillage our planet and funnel more money into the pockets of millionaires. We're also witnessing hyper-militarization in the region. Last year, the US spent $997 billion on military out of the 2,718 billion world military expenditure. This is the highest global total ever recorded by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. At the same time, extremely expensive military exercises like RIMPAC, the world's largest international maritime warfare exercise, continues to take place in Hawaii, a place that remains illegally occupied. Māori activist Tina Ngata states that militarism has always been in support of that ongoing colonial project. It is a violent project. It's a project founded on dispossession and slave-based economy. Many Pacific communities have been heavily impacted by nuclear testing in the region, including Kiribati, French Polynesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. For the 12 years between 1946 and 1958, 67 US nuclear bombs shattered the Bikini and Enewetak atolls in the Marshall Islands. 6 islands were completely vaporized, and the people of Rongelap were exposed to shocking levels of radiation. On March the 1st, 1954, the hydrogen bomb, known as Bravo, was detonated on Bikini Atoll after the US forcibly displaced its residents. This bomb was 1,000 times more powerful, or had an explosive yield 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb which devastated Hiroshima. Rongelap Islanders were then also displaced and forced to evacuate to Kwajalein Atoll for decontamination. And now I'm just going to play 2 short videos to help us understand what this history means today for these communities, because I feel like sometimes the written to the actual understanding gets a little bit lost.
Ya lo tagam putolo yorong lo. Ni mutan peri wai, wini yutongane peri. Yeni. Yeni we chulun pipure baiti. And I yeni me pamo. Ni we janu de la pa. Pe pobre ke mitena. Ni pure jaga. Mga rewa lakan tiba-tiba por rei luya dinem jana. Kalau kan mga payili kan, boleh nunakan kikit lah kan. Kita nak kompan ni nanti.
Between 1946 and 1958, nobody knew what was going on here. A lot of Americans don't even understand the full scope of damages that happened. You know, it was about 108 megatons. So that's about 1.6 Hiroshima bombs being detonated every day for 12 years.
Giar tolak itu zero rardong ranan perinen hola mai itu kan kagil rubeler tam kagil lagai itu kan bijai ngai tanlale yo cukup pulang roi aku mau raglo merana apa paisin merana.
Most of the Marshallese in this category developed multiple skin lesions, usually not severe, predominantly on the scalp, back of the neck, and feet.
When you think about the Holocaust, people will let you forget that, right? But then when you open an American textbook, where are the equally depressing stories where people from Whanganui-a-Tara Atoll were forcibly enlisted into this top secret project so that they could test the effects of nuclear radiation? And they also had control groups, and they brought in people that weren't there when Bravo happened, just so that they could compare the difference between people who were forcibly injected with nuclear radiation versus people that were, downwind of the nuclear testing.
Well, Lori Munchalawa, and me, and un canun pin, un canun ne, again punin, and one and clip. Look at the roll canoe, Claric, I let parade, I walk, and of many yellow gun. You don't live again. While you long year.
People, want the restoration of their dignity by having the United States admit that there was a wrong committed. They should be acting on, their goodwill. That has yet to happen.
Very low, Lanai, wrong. Alvana Manan, very low that. We lose. Well, that rate come I'm there rather than come one millionaire, so right. We did in a jump ticket. Takangan ano tela lang ha. Kaya tela par nangin kanata. Mga American rock.
Okay, that's the first video, and then this is the second one.
I'm coming to meet you. I'm coming to see you. What stories will I find? Will I find an island or a tomb? To get to this tomb, take a canoe. Take a canoe through miles of scattered sun. Swallow endless, swirling sea. Gulp down radioactive lagoon. Do not bring flowers or speeches. There will be no white stones to scatter along this grave. There will be no songs to sing. How shall we remember you? You were a whole island once. You were breadfruit trees, heavy with green globes of fruit, whispering promises of massive canoes. Crabs dusted with white sand scuttled through pandanus roots. Beneath looming coconut trees, beds of watermelons slept still, swollen with juice. And you were protected by powerful Iroij chiefs birthed from women who could swim pregnant for miles beneath a full moon. Then you became testing ground. 9 nuclear weapons consumed you one by one by one, engulfed in an inferno of blazing heat. You became crater, an empty belly. Plutonium ground into a concrete slurry filled your hollow caverns. You became tomb. You became concrete shell. You became solidified history. Immovable. Unforgettable. You were a whole island once. Who remembers you beyond your death? Who would have us forget that you were once green globes of fruit, pandanus roots, and whispers of canoes? Who knows the stories of the life you led before? Here is a story of a turtle goddess. She gifted one of her sons, Ledao, a piece of her shell anointed with power, a leathery green fragment hollow as a piece of bark. It gave Ledao the power to transform into anything, into houses and trees, the shapes of other men, even kindling for the first fire. He almost burned us alive. I am looking for more stories. I look and I look. There must be more to this than incinerated trees, a cracked dome, a rising sea, a leaking nuclear waste with no fence. There must be more to this than a concrete shell that houses death. Here's the story of another shell, anointed with power. Ledao used it to transform into kindling for the first fire. He gave this fire to a small boy. The boy almost burned his entire village to the ground. Licks of fire leapt from skin and bones, from strands of coconut leaves. While the boy cried, Ledao laughed and laughed. This is a story of a people on fire. We pretend it is not burning all of us. Here is the story of the ways we've been tricked, the lies we've been fed. It's not poisonous anymore. Your illnesses are normal. You're fine. You're fine. My belly is a crater empty of stories and answers. Only questions. Hard as concrete. Who gave them this power? Who anointed them with the power to burn?
So, I'll just say, but what she was standing on as she said that poem was the dome in which all of the nuclear waste was buried, which a whole bunch of nuclear waste was buried. So it's a radioactive dome called Runet Dome. In 1979, Palau became the world's first nuclear-free country, an act of sovereignty in the Pacific. But the US spent millions trying to subvert this decision, forcing the people of Palau to vote 15 times on their nuclear-free constitution. Outright violence was also a tactic the US used to suppress nuclear opposition. In 1985, the country's first president, Hau'otearoa Remelik, was suspiciously assassinated. Just 10 days later, France bombed the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour as it prepared to sail to protest nuclear testing at Moruroa Atoll. These events were not isolated, but part of a web of militarisation, colonial control, and capitalist exploitation that all continue to shape the Pacific today. Only 5 days ago was the 40-year commemoration since the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, an act of French state terrorism in New Zealand. In 1975, the Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific Peoples, so NFIP group, emerged from the first regional Nuclear-Free Pacific Conference in Fiji. From its inception, the group positioned itself not just against nuclear testing, but against the wider struggle of imperialism and militarization in the region, recognizing that nuclear testing happens in territories under colonial occupation. NFIP campaigners supported the struggles for self-determination and independence in Kanaky, French Polynesia, and West Papua. They denounced the presence of US military bases in the Philippines, condemned the use of Kwajalein Atoll for MX and other missile testing, and called for an end to uranium mining, and advocated for Balau's nuclear-free constitution. This expansive movement was not just a protest campaign, but a call for systemic change and a fight for Indigenous self-determination, decolonization, and political independence. I include this next chapter of history to prompt a wider question. How do we ensure Pacific liberation movements practice true solidarity? Which brings us to the Fiji coups, where government officials, elites, and international powers all worked to splinter Fiji's dangerous class-conscious workers' movement. In 1987, with backing from the US and France, Sitiveni Rambuka led the overthrow of Prime Minister Timothy Bavandra's Labour government, an action that was soon followed by a second coup. Although these were framed as a movement for Indigenous rights, in reality they established a government that served elite interests and deepened social divisions. Prior to the coups, Fiji had one of the most highly developed trade union systems of the South Pacific nations. In 1959, a major multiracial oil strike broke out after the creation of the Wholesale and Retail Workers' General Union. This strike united Itoke Fijians and Indo-Fijians in their demands for a doubled minimum wage, paid sick leave, a 40-hour work week, and 2 weeks paid vacation. Workers blockaded oil depots, halting access to gas, and crowds of thousands emerged onto the streets. This act of cross-ethnic class solidarity between Indigenous workers and Indo-Fijian workers was met with repression from the state. Police deployed tear gas and batons, and the government rushed to fracture this labour movement by appealing to Indigenous Fijian identity. As early as 1982, the US had been actively subverting Fiji's unions and undermining the Pacific trade union community, largely in reaction to the region's growing support for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. Socialist Vinil Kumar poignantly observes that this decision illustrates the class divide that cuts through the Pacific and its various ethnic and racial groups. The following coup in 2000 did nothing to help with these tensions, and then there was the coup in 2006, which seemed to have more of a mood for bridging racial divisions, but this was no genuine people's movement for true liberation. Fiji's 3 military coups were seen by some as a defense of Indigenous sovereignty, but for many other Indigenous peoples, including Kanak representatives, it was condemned. Former Fiji Times journalist Vijay Naidu poignantly observes, "They must not allow their justifiable concern for Indigenous rights in the Pacific to cloud their judgment on Fiji. If they cannot make the distinction between justice and hypocrisy, they cannot hope to advocate the cause of any disadvantaged group anywhere." When Rambuka seized power in Fiji in 1987, he sought training from an elite unit of gendarme mobiles, the very same type of force that was repressing the Kanak struggle for freedom. We must confront the broader systems that enable the gross exploitation of human beings. Overwhelmingly, we have seen the oppression of colonization and the ongoing impacts that our Pacific communities endure. There's an increase of hugely powerful and destructive weapons in the region, which continue the already traumatic legacy of nuclear colonialism. The spiderweb of international interference and subversion to ensure big powers make money from the exploitation of the working class is ever expanding. And here in Aotearoa, our government follows repressive US currents such as the implementation of restrictions on puberty blockers, the NZ first proposed bill to remove DEI regulations, and the relentless attacks on the Indigenous people of this land. But as I have just laid out, we have powerful histories of resistance to turn to. Let us learn from our ancestors and continue the fight. In this struggle, we must use working class solidarity as a tool against all forms of oppression. Nobody's free until everybody's free. We must dare to dream of a better future. As Chief Rewi Manga Maniapoto famously said, "Ka whawhai tonu mātou, ake tonu ake." We will fight on forever and ever. And I just want to end with this last slide by Jesse Unai. and you can read that. And you can let that fuel the discussion, sort of, I don't know, bringing in that link to Palestine as well at the end, if you feel inspired to touch on that. Thanks.